And yeah, just as Dan said, I think too, just keep it down to a question. I'll do my best to answer it as well. Okay, well,
you're getting Jim. I'm another Jim.
Okay, so Jim number 2.
My question, I think, or comment ties in to Jim's.
Okay.
And that is, frankly, you confused me more than once. But you confused me by confusing God with Christ. You talked a lot about God, but then you made your pitch at the end to go to Christ. Now, why can't I imagine an imam talking about the God of the universe from his perspective, and it gets to Jim's question, which God?
That's correct.
If God is the God of the universe, which God? The Buddhist God, the Christian God, the Jewish God, the Islam God, and why should I choose any of these based on a straw house called the Bible, which has historically been proved? You know, so you're starting from an assumption that's built on a straw house.
Okay. Well, let me just try to best answer. That's why I debate people of other religions and do open forums and so on. First of all, we can check the books. We have to have, again, I agree with in terms of reason, but I believe that reason comes from basically that when Thomas Aquinas, for example, gave his cosmological argument, that natural law came from the law of God. So again, the question becomes which God, which is a reasonable question, comes in the form of, well, which God or which thing, and I can deal with the Bible in just a second, best corresponds to reality as we know it. We can look at some of the creation epics of certain gods and just dismiss them. Now, Islam, for example, heavily contradicts Scripture in the sense that, and then at the same time claims in other times to go to the people of the book and that they should never be disputed. But then the problem is there's a doctrine in Islam called the law of abrogation, where certain surahs and certain books written at a later time can override them. But the question is easy. We have a rationale put into us by God, which I would call reason, so I have no problem with that part, where we can reason in terms of what epic best corresponds to reality. Now, here's the problem with this, is as human beings, we're finite in knowledge. We are finite in the sense that we don't know everything about anything, which I can make the philosophical case that means that faith absolutely must be intact. And I'm not talking about blind credulity, for example. I'm speaking about faith that is based on knowledge. And at the same time, we may see people abuse this thing. We may see things that God does as mysterious. But at the same time, we also don't know all the facts. For example, when we go to the law of God and they say, kill somebody or something like that, well, first of all, the problem is that we don't know the extenuating circumstances. We don't know. The law was a summary of what happened in Old Testament Israel that would basically, if this was to transpire, this would be the punishment. Now, was that always the case? Not necessarily. We don't have any court dockets to prove that. Sometimes God was merciful. The first time some of the infractions of the Old Testament Israelites, they would have been dead. There wouldn't have been Israel. So obviously, there are certain things that we can do. Now, as far as the historical unreliability of Scripture, if you want to go that route, I would be more interested in more specific questions. But basically, there is nothing in the entire of ancient antiquity that is more historically reliable in its transmission than the New Testament.
Excuse me.
And let me finish. Okay, and then you're more than free to rebut that. And we have more manuscripts, and we have more. First of all, we have the largest number of manuscripts in all of ancient antiquity, and then number two, it's the closest. The documents are the closest from the last written original, and this has been shown over and over again in scholarship. This is not even. This is just. Even Bart Ehrman admits it's the most well-transmitted ancient document in human history. But let me just finish. So you have those two tests. Homer's Iliad is in second place. It only has 600 manuscripts, and then the last written original was a little bit just before the dawn of Christ. And then the first existing copy we have in 1200 AD. Go ahead.
Okay. No, I don't want you know, keep going like we had before.
Sure,
One
yes,
more
sir.
people to ask.
Okay.
I would say your answer is totally unsatisfactory from my point of view, but let other people
That's
ask
fine.
questions.
May I just want to go back to an earlier issue, just to make sure we stay on the morality topic. I heard what I believe is a false dichotomy, and that is if there's no moral absolutes, then you're left with moral relativism. And I think that's absolutely false. There are no moral absolutes because morality is necessarily tied to the consequences of action. So if you take an action or a command, let's say, and set it apart, totally devoid of the circumstances in which it occurs, then you have no basis for which to judge whether or not it's moral. I'll give you an example. The Bible tells us that killing is wrong. Murder is wrong. Okay? Well, implicit in the term murder are the circumstances. So just killing itself is not necessarily wrong if, for example, you're defending yourself or your family. So it's the circumstances and the consequences that follow from those circumstances and the actions that determine whether something is moral. You don't have to be a moral relativist, which I am not, in order for you to see that moral absolutes don't exist. So I just want to make sure that we understand that distinction. And I hear it a lot, that if you don't believe in God's moral absolutes, then you're a moral relativist and anything goes. That's not the case, because we are constrained by the consequences of the actions themselves, and we can reason that out. And that's what we consider moral, are the actual consequences of what happens.
Your name, sir?
Brian.
Ryan?
Here.
Yes, sir.
Closest we got to absolute moral is in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill. That sounds pretty, or thou shalt not murder, depending upon your translation. But then the texts go on in other places in Leviticus, whatever, to describe the death penalty for disobedient children, adulterous wives, homosexuals, and people picking up sticks on the Sabbath. Should we implement those laws today?
The question becomes, again, it's a definitional framework of what happens in the Old Testament law. A really good book that can address those issues was written by Paul Courtney called Is God a Moral Monster? And what happens is again, the execution of those particular laws are not shown. We see the law and the consequence. Now, the problem becomes well, we can make this, but again, my question, first of all, is on an epistemological level here. This is what this is what the whole debate was about. How can we ground ethics? We may not like what necessarily God does, okay? But those things were implemented. First of all, Israel was a covenant people. God was showing that there is a certain standards for His people in order that they would conduct themselves in a certain way. But again, and I would take disagreement with Dan's argument, again, without an absolute moral set of standards, anything is permissible. This has been shown throughout history. So again, Dostoevsky, a lot of the philosophers, even Nietzsche's Madman says, how are we going to redefine right and wrong? And again, the word reason, I mean, no, whose reason? And again, that's what I'm saying. So, I mean, the divine command is the only thing that really grounds ethics. You do this, this is the consequence. But again, there are other, what we would call, and Joseph Flesher wrote a book called Situational Ethics. At certain times, certain divine mandates and laws and things were implemented. But again, I don't have any court dockets to see how those were necessarily carried out. However, if, first of all, I don't, and the problem becomes, the other issue becomes is a logical one. Because if human reason is the reason, or the means by which